2018 marks the 40th anniversary of the Treaty of Peace and Friendship between China and Japan. Last month, the Japanese cabinet also approved a record-breaking defense budget totaling $46 billion, showing the sixth straight annual increase since Prime Minister Shinzo Abe took office. As the recently re-elected Liberal Democratic Party works to revise Japan's constitutional amendment, what's the outlook for China-Japan relations in the year ahead? I'm Zheng Lai, sitting in for Liu Xin with a third edition of a special series looking ahead to the world in 2018. Joining me for the discussions today are Xiyu, Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. From Tokyo, we have Mr. Takesato Watanabe, Professor Emeritus at Doshisha University, and from Washington D.C, Mr. Abram Denmark, Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. Happy New Year to you all. Thank you for joining us. So let me start by asking you, Professor Watanabe, in the New Year speech, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe emphasized Japan is facing the most severe security environment since World War II, and his administration is continuing to push forward the constitutional amendment, especially changing Article 9, which validates the existence of the SDF, or the Self-Defense Force. What is the significance of Article 9 for Japan?
Article 9 of Japan Constitution, people loved peace after the war, and also United States forced Japan not to have any military powers. So this article was put into the Constitution. It was good, and it is still good for most of the people of Japan. But for Mr. Abe, he has to realize two things. One is that to change the Constitution and make the past history well done. And also, he has to pick up the military lines of the Trump, and he must change the Constitution if he wants to spend much money to support Trump. These are the two things for Mr. Abe to change the Constitution. And if the Constitution is not possible to be changed, he has to change radically the U.S. security guidelines with Japan.
Mr. Denmark, what is the view from the U.S. where you're sitting?
Well, we have been working with Japan for several decades to enhance Japan's ability to defend itself and contribute to our alliance. Most Americans see our alliance with Japan as very strong and as critical to the stability and prosperity of the Asia-Pacific. We did revise the defense guidelines a couple of years ago, which greatly expanded the breadth of our alliance. But many Americans have been calling on Japan to revise the Constitution in order to enable the Self-Defense Force to have a stronger legal foundation and to put Japan in a stronger place to be able to defend itself and to contribute more to the U.S.-Japan alliance.
Mr. Yang in the studio, Abe is going to need his LDP to reach consensus on this amendment. What disagreements exist within LDP's different factions, and how will they affect Abe's mission to achieve the amendment to give Japan a rebirth, as he calls it, by 2020?
Well, I don't think Abe will be able to completely achieve what he wants to revive the Constitution. However, he will conduct in gradual way to make change. At least he will make a breaking point for the as the starting of the revision and leave a path for his successors. For example, he will keep the existing wordings in the Article 9, meanwhile adding some words new. That means open a door for remilitarization of Japan. I think that is Abe's tactics, although he has a leader ruling alliance that controls 2/3 votes in the parliament.
Mr. Watanabe, does this amendment reflect what the Japanese people want? And does it matter?
If the revision of the Constitution 9 can be put into the diet, I think it will be passing. But the people of Japan have different ideas, because to change or to revise the constitution, they must get the support of the people. But in the last election, actually, number of the votes of the people, you see, more than half went to the opposition parties. And LDP and Komeito is really, you see, more than 2/3 in the Diet. But to revise the constitution, they must pass 2 stages, Diet and the people's votes. So it is not so easy for Mr. Abe to revise the constitution itself.
But Mr. Yang, Mr. Abe actually attempted to amend the constitution 10 years ago, which was partly why he had to depart from the post as PM. But everything now seems to be on track. So what lessons did he learn from that? And what's different about the proposal this time?
Well, I think firstly, the Article 9 of the Constitution is not the cornerstone for Japanese domestic politics, for the nature of the nation, but also it's a really significant point for the neighboring country of Japan in Asia, because changing of the Article 9 of the Constitution means changing the nature of Japan now, which remains a peaceful Japan, or pacifist Japan. When the Article 9 is changed, that will mean he will make a game changer. Not only change Japan's military position, change the nature and structure of U.S.-Japan alliance, but also will change the balance of power in this region.
Mr. Denmark, something technical here. Abe has said that discussions related to changing the National Defense Program guidelines will launch this year, and the current version of the guidelines was passed in 2013 and originally valid for 10 years. So how are these guidelines linked to the constitutional amendment?
Well, the Constitution provides a framework for Japan, for its self-defense force and the roles that the self-defense force can play. The defense guidelines really is more of a framework for how the alliance works, how the U.S. forces and the self-defense forces work together, the missions that they go on, their investments, those sorts of things. So really the Constitution, I think, provides the broader overarching framework. And I think it's important to note that many of the key provisions in the Constitution are not likely to change. That the Constitution currently says that Japan would not use force or threaten the use of force in order to resolve disputes, and that is almost certainly not going to go away. What the proposed revisions to the Constitution would ultimately do would be to put the self-defense force on a much stronger legal foundation in the Constitution, which would enable the self-defense force to play a broader role, but would also provide a more open framework for the U.S.-Japan alliance to think about and find out ways in which we could cooperate more extensively across different areas of national security.
Now let's talk about this record-breaking defense budget of $46 billion, which was passed recently. It is the 6th annual increase under Abe. Do you see Japan moving away from the defensive approach to an offensive strategy? You first, Mr. Watanabe.
For Mr. Abe, he wants to do 2 things concerning this matter. The constitutional revision, if it is difficult, he wants to change the contents and the sentences of the defense guidelines. In Japan, more than 80% of the constitution scholars, they think that the self-defense forces itself has some problems in the constitution, and also to send the military troops to outside of Japan to settle the disputes with the United States or with other allies, it is constitutionally wrong and also dangerous. However, the people want to have the safety and security inside the society of Japan against the North Korea especially. So Mr. Abe and also the group of Mr. Abe, they are thinking and talking every day about North Korean problems, missiles and nuclear weapons and like that. So Mr. Abe he can get the support of the people by talking to the North Korean problems, and also he has the reason to increase so much the budget for the military defense. This is very contradictory, but this is politically true in the way of Mr. Abe's policies.
Mr. Yang, do you think this is justified in terms of the defense budget increase?
No. According to the existing pacifist constitution, such a constant increase of military budget will certainly gradually change the nature of the so-called self-defense forces in Japan. In Abe's plan, he wants to change the Article 9 of the Constitution so that they can change the existing Japan into the so-called normal state. In fact, the normal state means the normal of military forces of Japan. By normalized military forces, they need to make two fronts efforts. One front is the legal efforts. We have seen he got a lot of political impulse to revise regulations, legislations to turn the self-defense forces into the normal forces, military forces. And the front two is the budget effort. As you mentioned, during the past 6 years, he has made a constant effort to increase the budget to the current level, and I believe and I think next year and in the following year, as long as the Prime Minister Abe in the office, the military budget will continue to increase so that they can turn the self-defense forces into a normal military forces that commands both offensive and defensive capabilities.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Denmark? Do you see that shift as well? Do you also see the budget growing?
I actually see that the growing defense budget for Japan is perfectly understandable and quite reasonable. As Prime Minister Abe said, Japan's external security environment has grown increasingly challenging in recent years. There are North Korean ballistic missiles flying over Japan. Japan is in range of North Korean weapons of mass destruction. Japan is also increasingly concerned about an ever more powerful and assertive PLA from China, I'm sorry to say. And so they see this environment as increasingly challenging and are increasing the defense budget in a way that I think is actually quite reasonable. It's not a radical increase. It has been a sustained increase, as you said. But Japan's defense budget still is far behind that of China by a factor of over $100 billion a year. So I see this as Japan trying to keep pace with an increasingly challenging security environment. And my hope, frankly, and my expectation is that Japan will continue to make the investments necessary to ensure that it can continue to defend itself.
And that's good news for U.S. arms suppliers, right? Okay, we are going to...
I think that it's good news for the people of Japan, and I think it's good news for the U.S.-Japan alliance. I think that the commercial considerations of this have zero impact in Japan's decision-making, but rather what I think is the critical impact, in my experience, has been ensuring that the people of Japan and ensuring that the U.S.-Japan alliance is effective against the increasingly challenging environment that it faces.
Thank you so much. Please, we are going to take a short break here on The Point. We'll be back with a lot more discussion on the outlook for Japan in 2018. You're back with The Point. I am Chen Lei, subbing in for Liu Xin. Let's continue our Japan Outlook special series with our three guests in the studio in Washington, D.C. and in Tokyo. Thank you for sticking around. So the Abe administration has been emphasizing the DPRK threat to justify these constitutional amendments, but recent news shows that ROK and DPRK may be seeking to smooth tensions. Will Japan continue to use DPRK as a reason to increase its defense budget and revise the constitution? Mr. Watanabe, you go first.
This news of the direct talks between North and South of Korea, this is very good, but for Mr. Trump and Mr. Abe, and also the military industry-related people, this is not so good. Because for Mr. Abe, he needs attention in the politics and also in the activities of his political activities inside Japan. Because to manipulate the public opinion or public, I dare say, sentiment, he needs the North Korea. This is true because right after the election of last, Vice Prime Minister also said, LDP got the overwhelming victory because North Korean friend helped us. You see, this is very cynical, but this is true. This is the politics and the media and the political leaders' relations. So in this case, if the North and South talks directly on the occasion of the Pyongyang Olympics, this is good for the people, but not so good for the political leaders, especially for Mr. Abe.
Mr. Yang, would you agree with that? I mean, in politics, we see that sort of justification being used all the time for certain political movements.
Yes, let me put it by this way. Even without the increasing North Korean threats, nuclear and missile threats, Japan will certainly, Abe's administration will certainly increase the military budget and will certainly revise the constitution of the Article 9. So for the politician in Japan, right-wing politician Japan, regardless as the Prime Minister Abe or some people else, they need to keep making enemies of Japan so that they can make excuses to increase military budgets, to to push forward revising the constitution. So that's no direct relationship with either DPRK or PLA or Russia. The nature is they need to do that, and for the need, they need to do some excuse by making enemies.
Do you think so, Mr. Denmark? Do you think the DPRK actually has, and what it threatens to do actually has a bearing on military budgets?
I think that Japan's, as I said, I think Japan's increasing defense budget is directly related to the intensifying threat that it faces in the region. Personally speaking, I think that the warmer ties, potential for warmer ties between North and South Korea, the potential for talks between North and South Korea is an extremely positive development. But I would note that even while Kim Jong-un was calling for dialogue with the South, he also reaffirmed his commitment to the development of nuclear weapons and of ballistic missiles, both of which are in contravention of numerous UN Security Council resolutions. So my expectation is that serious security planners in the United States and Japan, in South Korea, and even in China are looking at what North Korea does, looking at North Korea's actions, and assuming and believing that the threat is going to continue, even if dialogue between North and South may take off. So, in looking at the long term, my expectation is that the security environment around Japan will continue to grow more complicated and challenging, and that Japan will need to do more in order to ensure that it can defend itself.
And Mr. Watanabe, do you see closer Japan-US military cooperation in 2018, given that a few months ago when Trump went to Japan, he said that Tokyo should buy massive amounts of US military equipment to guard itself against the DPRK?
For Japan, we want to have the peace and prosperous society. However, as far as you see the international surroundings, especially in the East Asian area, is like this, we must defend ourselves. It is true, but Japan has been closely connected to the United States in the past. Again, still now it is true. So if the United States want to increase the power together with together with Japan in the East Asian area, they need the increase of Japanese military budget. However, the military budget is coming from the taxpayers. So as far as the United States want to decrease their own budget for Japan area in East Asia, the United States want to make Japan increase so much about this field. So this is very balanced in a sense. But for Mr. Abe, another point is that he must keep the support of the people by keeping the tension in this area. So this is very contradictory against the United States ideas and also the Japanese people peace-seeking attitude. So this is very contradictory, but we must solve the questions among the people.
And Mr. Yang, how do regional powers feel about Abe's often repeated message about the strength of the Japan-US alliance?
Well, Japan-US make a joint effort to strengthen the military alliance is good news for security of Japan and the US, frankly, and I need to recognize that. But the problem is, the region we shared is based on the divided security interests among members. Basically, this region, for example, Northeast Asia, all the states, including the outside power U.S., live in a political base with a collective security bloc and a non-member of the bloc. Say, U.S., Japan, and South Korea are the so-called collective security bloc members. So whenever the members states strengthen the security, that means the insecurity for the other members. They need to increase their military capability. When Japan increases the military budget, that will trigger the non-members increasing the military budget. So in other words, every state's efforts on their own security interests always trigger the concerns and the worries and the facts of the insecurity for other members. That's the sad story for this region. So the more efforts Japan and the U.S. made for their own collective security, that will mean the more insecure for the other countries. We will fall in deeper and deeper negative interactions in security dilemma in this region.
Mr. Denmark, is that how the U.S. perceives it?
I think most people in the United States, most experts in the United States, perceive it a bit differently. Although mentioning the concerns about a security dilemma, I think, is very well founded. Most Americans, myself included, see a stronger U.S.-Japan alliance as very important, both for the stability of Asia, but also for American interests around the region. And my expectation is that our alliance will continue to go stronger into 2018. In terms of how other countries in the region may react to it, I think most countries across the region are actually quite comfortable with a strong U.S.-Japan alliance and have good relations with both the United States and Japan. An important outlier, though, of course, being China. What I would point out, however, as I mentioned earlier, is that China's defense budget has been increasing at a very rapid pace for several decades now. And I see Japan's increasing defense budget as really an attempt to keep pace with an increasingly challenging environment. But concerns about a security dilemma, I think, are well-founded.
Okay,
and so beyond looking at
the outlook for relations between China and Japan being the 40th year of that Treaty of Friendship and Peace. But given these constitutional amendments, how will bilateral relations develop this year, Mr. Watanabe?
To keep the security in Asia, not only in Asia, but globally speaking, China, Japan, and South Korea, these are very economically developed countries. And the power of the United States is getting down. So in this case, China, South Korea, Japan are united if it is realized, we don't need to make more, concerns about the military increase inside Japan and also in China and South Korea. This is my conclusion.
And Mr. Yang, we know that Japan has been trying to get Chinese President Xi to visit for a long time. How would you describe China's reception to these invitations, and how likely is it this bilateral meeting will take place this year?
Well, I think this year is very hopeful. However, let me put it this way. Firstly, China always attaches importance to China-Japan relation. By the same token, China pays special attention to Japan's invitation to President Xi's visit to Japan, as you mentioned. However, everyone knows the top-level exchanges between two countries need a proper political base. Unfortunately, now we need to build up the base. We haven't got such a proper base. So I think this year, under the background of the 45th anniversary of the bilateral friendship treaty, I think the two sides should make a joint effort to improve the relations. Fundamentally, the two sides should strengthen the position and implement the fourth political documents between the two countries made during the past decades. Only based on the four political documents, I think the state visit by President Xi and the further exchanges between the two countries at every level can be brought about.
Thank you so much, and we hope for regional peace, stability and prosperity. Thank you so much to our three wonderful guests, Mr. Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies from Tokyo, Takesato Watanabe, Professor Emeritus at Doshisha University, and from Washington D.C, Mr. Abram Denmark, Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. Thank you so much for your insights. That's going to do it for this edition of The Point. I'm Cheng Lei in Beijing. You can download the application called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching.